most people just don't know how to engage with their mind and personalities without it automatically coming from the ego. And even if it's not always coming from the ego, they don't know when the ego comes in and they don't know when the ego comes out. So we have to start very carefully, very slowly, very mindfully with this, working with this precise science. And as we get more comfortable, because what I call the authentic self, the self that's not ego, feels free. Because it's not burdened by all the problems and fears and concerns of your ego. It just isn't. It's not denying that they're there, that your ego has these problems, but that part of yourself isn't burdened by them, isn't threatened by them, and isn't particularly intimidated by them. So why we want to spend time cultivating our capacity to develop this skill is so slowly we want to learn how to include more and more of the human experience without including the ego. And then we want to get to the point where we more or less include just about every aspect of the human experience that that makes sense to include. There's a lot of things we don't want to include because they're just totally insane. But we want to include every aspect, or as much as possible, that makes sense to include, while still leaving the ego out in the cold. Now, that doesn't mean the ego is never going to get in there, right? Because it will at times. But the thing is, it means most of the time, which is what counts, it won't. But we have to learn how to do that. That doesn't happen just as a result of awakening. It's not a flash of non-dual insight into the nature of reality. It's just a skill you have to learn. It's a different way of being. It's a different state of consciousness. It's a different level of awareness that takes practice and discipline and practice and discipline and commitment and practice and discipline and commitment. But it can be done. But you have to be really committed. And remember, there's two dimensions to it. One, as I just explained, one is transcending, learning how to transcend, see through, and objectify our psychological fears, concerns, worries, and desires and attachments. We really have to learn how to objectify them and become very familiar with what they are for us. And the other is learning how to discern and objectify all the ways in which we are still attached and identified with cultural values that we actually are trying to transcend. Because once again, in the way I was explaining before, most of us are still emotionally identified with cultural values that we may be simultaneously trying to transcend because we've had a vision, we've experienced insight, we've had moments of enlightened awareness, we've seen through to another possibility for human beings and for ourselves that we are aspiring towards. But at the same time, there may be, and probably is, areas of our psyche, of ourselves, that are still emotionally embedded or emotionally attached to values that are in conflict with what we're aspiring for. And so making that conscious, because in, I haven't spoken a lot about this in this particular retreat, but the self, the personal self, is not merely an ego, it's also a culturally created self-structure. So culture creates the ego also. Right? Your psychological self doesn't exist in isolation from culture. Culture produces it and creates it. So culture is not empty of preferences. Culture is our worldviews and values and emotional preferences. It's the big superego. So that's embedded in the very ground of our self. It's closer than close. It's very difficult to see these dimensions of ourself because it's literally the very fabric and ground of the self that we are. So learning how to objectify, and we can do this in this kind of holonic work, and also just in our own consideration and observation of ourselves. But you want to learn to objectify the old and objectify the new, objectify the old, so you can help. It helps to make subject object, what was subject, what was self. Object, when you objectify it, you can actually begin to see it. If it's still only subject, you can't see it, right? So if this is, for example, the old values, if the old values are subject, you can't see it. They're there, and you say, where? I can't see it, but it's too close. That's why you can't see it. So you have to make subject, object, and then when it becomes object, you go, oh. So it was there all the time, but you just literally couldn't see it because it was you. So when you make it object, then you can suddenly see it. When you see it, you can change your relationship to it. But if you can't see it, you can't change your relationship to it. So it's difficult to do at a psychological level, but it's much more challenging to do at the level of these values, the shared superego, the culturally conditioned self. And once again, the reason is because there's many ways in which we're emotionally embedded, probably in shoulds and shouldn'ts and preferences, desires and attachments that may come from, that may have nothing to do with what we believe we're aspiring for. And so it takes a lot of work to sort all this out. But that's a big part of the work to be done.